to welcome Dr. Daniel Isbell, Assistant Professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dan currently serves on the editorial boards of Language Testing and TESOL Quarterly. His primary research interests are language testing and research methods in applied linguistics. Then today we'll talk about misconduct and questionable research practices in applied linguistics. So today's agenda will be Mon, the co-convener of our research network, and I will interview Dan with a couple of questions that our readers may have, and then there will be a free Q&A. So the reading we are talking about today is a journal article written by Dan and colleagues. The title is Misconduct and Questionable Research Practices, the Ethics of Quantitative Data Handling and Reporting in Applied Linguistics. This article was published in Modern Language Journal, a leading journal in applied linguistics. And you can find the post-print version of the article in the chat box. I'm sending it again. Please do check out. And now I will stop sharing and let's jump into the discussion. So hello, Dan. Could you please briefly introduce this paper to us?
Sure. Happy to. I guess before I get started with the paper, I just wanted to acknowledge all my co-authors on the paper. So in case you missed it on the slide, it was a big team effort. So Dan Brown, Meishan Chen, Deirdre Derrick, Romy Ghanem, Marie Nelly Gutierrez Arvizu, Aaron Schnur, Mei Shu Shang, and Luke Plonsky. So those were my collaborators on this project. And that was really one of the joys of working on this project, a big team of people all concerned with issues of research quality and ethics. So it wasn't all me just because I'm the first here. About the study, right? It was a survey-based study, and what we were interested in surveying were the research practices of applied linguistics researchers. And we were looking at primarily two types of research practices, and not necessarily the good kinds of research practices. So we're looking at misconduct and questionable research practices. So between those two, misconduct is kind of clearly the more bad or wrong kind of thing to be doing. Misconduct, the way we looked at in our study, includes things like fabricating data, so making up data, or otherwise falsifying your data or results. So sort of editing results, manipulating data to achieve a particular result, that sort of thing. Sometimes we see in other fields, you can manipulate graphs or images that are collected with various instruments to sort of support the kind of findings you want to get, right? So that's misconduct, fabrication, falsification. Also often talked about in the broader literature is plagiarism when it comes to misconduct, research misconduct, but that's something we weren't really concerned with in this paper. So misconduct is the clearly bad stuff we were looking at. And then we also looked at questionable research practices. And as the name suggests, right, these are research practices that are questionable. They're clearly not good. They're clearly not ideal, I should say. And they are varying degrees of not so sure about to kind of bad. Okay, so there are things there that are relatively mild, things that probably a lot of us have done or do, and things that are a little bit more, okay, this is not good, but they're not outright misconduct yet. So it's kind of this gray area between misconduct and then on the far other end where we all want to be in terms of, responsible conduct of research, the sort of best practices that we've come to agree on as a discipline. So QRPs are that middle area. And we put together a survey based on some previous studies coming from fields like psychology and medicine on QRPs and misconduct. And we surveyed 351 researchers in applied linguistics. The large majority of those folks, 261, were PhD holders. And they tended to be kind of like mid-career. I think the average year since PhD for those people was around 10 years or so. And these are people who I think are fairly typical researchers in the field, on average published about 2 papers a year, right? With some range, of course. Some people are more productive, some people take it a little bit slower, but I think we captured a pretty good slice of active researchers at the time in applied linguistics. And so really briefly, what we found, and I know we'll be talking more about the results as we continue the discussion today, we didn't necessarily find good news. We found that there were researchers who admitted to misconduct in terms of either fabricating data or otherwise falsifying results. And we found that questionable research practices were quite common among applied linguistics researchers.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for the very thoughtful and very detailed introduction. I mean, to a lot of us, actually, misconduct or questionable research practices, these look like a little bit sort of new concepts to us. We haven't seen many, especially research on this. So I guess before we delve further into the specific findings, we're more interested in the motive for this research. Like, what inspired you to conduct this study?
Yeah. I think a lot of the inspiration, first, Luke Plonsky deserves a lot of credit. I think he was the person who first got the ball rolling with this project. And Luke is someone who I think has, been paying attention to methodological issues and issues related to study quality in applied linguistics and second language research for quite some time now. But I think I can speak for all of us, and maybe a lot of you, other researchers in the field. We hear a lot about things, kind of big findings, famous papers from other fields, like the Ioannidis paper looking at, medical research, half of all published findings are probably not true, like these sort of flashy titles. There's a paper by Daniele Finelli who looked at misconduct and questionable research practices and found, that they're more common than we'd like to see in a range of disciplines. And we got to wondering, like, ooh, that's a little bit scary. How are we doing, actually? We don't know. Nobody's really looked at applied linguistics yet. Not to say that we're completely ignored by other fields, but I think we know kind of meta science researchers kind of focus on the bigger disciplines, psychology, medicine. And so at the point where, we started this project, we didn't have a good idea. We could only guess how prevalent these practices, these issues might be. So we thought, well, let's take a look. There's some useful tools and methodology we can borrow from other studies and see what we find.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. As you just said, nobody really know what will be like about misconduct and questionable research practices in applied linguistics specifically, and it focuses on methodology and is kind of based on self-reporting. And I was wondering, were there any challenges you faced during the study?
Yeah, it was actually, it's been a while since we carried out data collection and sort of did all the analyses. I don't require too many challenges during the study. It actually wasn't too hard to get people to respond to the survey. I will say, though, that the review process was on the longer side. And I think because in part, people, including some of the reviewers we had, wanted to tread kind of carefully when, considering these issues. And I think for good reasons, right? This is where we're asking people about kind of very much socially undesirable stuff, right? Nobody probably would in public want to get on a stage at a big conference like ILA or something and say, like, yeah, I made up my data, right? So it's not something we typically admit to publicly. And so there's a little bit of skepticism, like, can we trust these self-reports? I think, so I appreciate like the rigor of the review process, even though it did feel a bit long. And that's something we had to deal with. I kind of felt personally like, because the data collection was anonymous, I think that, sort of almost functioned as like a confessional for people responding. It's kind of like for those of you who don't know what a confessional is, in some churches, right, there's a screen between you and the priest, and you can sort of confess your sins, and it's sort of, they don't know exactly who you might be. And so there's this little bit of potentially safety in this anonymous data collection. And I also don't think people would want to respond just making stuff up because they thought it'd be fun. We were contacting people who were known to be researchers in the field. So we looked through conference programs and journal publication information to find email addresses of known researchers. So all in all, like, yeah, that was something we had to argue for in the paper and in the peer review process. But I think it's good that we were challenged on that. I think we should think carefully about methods in sort of meta-scientific research too.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Actually, my next question was going to be about the behind the scenes story. And I think you've already shared some really spicy and interesting behind the scenes story about us. I guess maybe we can deviate a little bit and talk about, how to deal with sort of this kind of sensitive topics or difficult topics during the review process. Maybe you can have some tips, some quick tips for, for our audience, because I guess a lot of people are going to face similar challenges, maybe down the road. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so this is yeah, it's really hard to give general advice on what to do with the review process when it comes to kind of sensitive topics. I think one thing is I think most reviewers do have good intentions, and when they question your methods and your conclusions, even the way you define constructs or concepts, it's mostly coming from a good place. At the same time, I don't think you always have to acquiesce. You don't always have to follow exactly what one reviewer wants. And so sometimes, you need to kind of push back a little bit and make your case, acknowledge that the reviewer is making a good point, but that you have other reasons for doing things the way you did, or choosing to keep things the way that you originally set out. So yeah, it's a little bit hard to provide specific advice, but I think with this really sensitive issue, some people, I don't want to say the reviewer or any of the reviewers were feeling called out by the research itself, but like this is something where people do have very strong opinions about, like, okay, hey, what's actually a questionable practice? It's like some of these things, and we can talk more about specific results, are like, come on, almost everybody does this. Is it right to call it questionable? And so I think that kind of reasoning is fair too. But we kind of made the argument that we need to hold ourselves and each other to higher standards, and was sort of the position we're taking in the paper.
Yeah, thanks for the tips, and many early career researchers do find the reviewing process a little bit tricky, but it's good that we can know some tips here. And talking about the paper, and there are multiple interesting research findings. And for example, your study found that 17% of respondents admitted one or more forms of scientific misconduct, and that 94% of respondents admitted one or more questionable research practices relevant to quantitative research. And how should we interpret this finding, and what are the things?
Yeah. So this is something, and I hope we were successful, but we wanted to make sure that the findings of this paper wouldn't be misinterpreted. So that 17%, right? It's kind of a shocking number. 17% of respondents may be something we could generalize roughly to the population of applied linguistics researchers. 1 in 6 people admitted to one or more forms of scientific misconduct. So the important thing to keep in mind there is like the unit of analysis. Like, what are we talking about? We're talking about individual people who did something at least once, okay? So it doesn't mean that 17% of all research is fraudulent or fabricated, right? So that was something important to keep in mind. When we looked at the specific survey responses, when people did admit to fraud, something, misconduct, they indicated a very low rate, like our lowest category in almost every case outside of a handful. So like 1 to 20% of the time. So we did a little bit in the paper, in the discussion, kind of back of the envelope, kind of rough estimation. If we take that 1 to 20% category and say, okay, maybe these people do it 10% of the time, then we could sort of calculate, okay, and they publish about, however many papers a year over some period of time. And so we came up in the end with a number of about 1.7% of studies in applied linguistics might contain some fabrication or otherwise fraud. And even that might be kind of a liberal estimate, because our survey, response, that 1 to 20% category, if it's only 1% of all the research, if somebody only does it once in their career, then actually that 1.7% number, we should probably downgrade that quite a bit. So we don't think that it's, at least when it comes to fraud, right, scientific misconduct, we don't think that's super prevalent in applied linguistic research. So that's a small comfort. I mean, it's not great to know that, 1 in 6 people have done it once, but it doesn't look like they're doing it all the time. And so ultimately, a lot of our sort of cumulative knowledge base is not based on fraud, thankfully. When it comes to the QRPs, though, this is something where, 94% have done at least one of the QRPs at least once, okay? And actually, like the mean and median responses were a bit higher than the 1 to 20% category for most of the QRPs. So this is something where, I didn't, kind of do the rough math yet, but I would probably guess that most published papers contain at least one or more questionable research practices. But one thing that's important to keep in mind there is that a lot of these things are fairly minor. One of our QRPs that we included in the study was reporting inexact p-values. So your p-value might be 0.03, 0.01, 0.4, 0.04, but you just do p less than 0.05 because that's our magical benchmark, right? That is not ideal, but it's also probably not the worst thing in the world, right? It sort of hampers our abilities in some cases to do meta-analysis, to do some sort of, things like p-curve analyses for assessing a body of research, but it's not quite as bad as many of the other QRPs. So like kind of taking all this with a grain of salt, I think is really important. Implications, there's a lot of implications, I think, from this paper in general. I think some of the other things we'll talk about today will get into more specifics, but at least when it comes to interpreting the studies, the study findings, like, yes, it's clearly not good, but we don't want to over or misinterpret what these numbers mean.
Yeah, this is really helpful because definitely we need help, sort of the audience, the reader would need help to, to better understand how do we interpret these numbers, because the 17% does look quite shocking at first sight, but now I think it's better contextualized so that we have a better understanding of, what that really means. And yeah, so speaking of interesting findings, there is another really interesting one. So your study found that early career researchers were the ones admitting to scientific misconduct. And how should we interpret this finding, and what are the implications?
Yeah, this one, I think it actually surprised me a little bit. I was actually hoping we'd see kind of better behavior from our early career researchers, just because, I would be in this boat. So this data was collected back in 2014, where I was just getting ready to start my own PhD program. And so, I feel like our generation of researchers, we're sort of coming of age at a time when people are talking about open science and when people are thinking more critically about, quantitative analyses in particular, right? Like how we interpret and report p-values, effect sizes, all that good stuff. And so I thought we might do a little better. But when it came to actually some of the worst practices that we surveyed, yeah, you're right. It was some of the earlier career researchers who reported doing this stuff a little bit more often. And I have to wonder, my hunch is that maybe it comes down to competition and precarity, right? The sort of publish or perish kind of mindset. And so, there's more pressure on researchers now than maybe folks who were early career researchers 20 or 30 years ago when, I mean, to be frank, the standards were lower back then, right? There probably wasn't as much pressure. And I'm sure people who lived through it back then probably said, oh no, I felt pressured when it came to getting a job and getting tenure. But I think it's probably fair to say that pressures are heightened today. And unfortunately, that may be pushing some early career researchers into bad decisions. So, implications of that, I mean, it kind of feels a little bit utopian to bring up, but can we look at different ways of evaluating researchers in terms of, for purposes of hiring, promotion, all of that stuff? But that's a hard ask. That's something hard to do, very hard to change, I feel. And the other thing is, can we bring ethical training more into our research methods courses? I mean, not just teaching people how to run some stats, but also the ethical decisions that go behind, that go on in the background when you are running your stats, or when you're cleaning your data, or when you are writing up the paper, trying to develop good ethics in our early career and junior researchers.
Yeah, I agree. And as a graduate researcher myself, I do hope that there will be more training on data handling and data reporting, and thank you for sharing that. It's one of the surprising findings for you, and I just wondering, were there any other findings, whether this is surprising or not, from your study that you would like to highlight?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to kind of continue on, I mean, that 70% figure is still shocking to me. It's still kind of surprising. One thing, that we found, in contrast to some other studies, if you look at some of these studies that kind of survey several fields, they find often higher rates of misconduct where there are more financial pressures involved. Okay, so whether it's funding from a grant, or industry-related funding, or industry-related research, right? Like if we think about medical research, pharmaceuticals, where like there are billions of dollars at stake, depending on certain trial outcomes and whatnot. And what sort of shocked me is, when you look at our results, we asked about that. Like, did you change your results or your data because you felt pressure from a funder? And maybe unexpectedly, those response rates were pretty low. A few people reported that. So that's not surprising in one way, right? Applied linguistics is not exactly in general, a high dollar or highly commercialized field, at least in a lot of research areas. But then it sort of makes me wonder, well, then, so why are we doing this? We're not getting a whole lot of pressure from funders. So why would people, otherwise choose to engage in misconduct? And as I already mentioned, career concerns, have to wonder about things like vanity, like if you publish a study that looks real clean and the results come out nice, does that sort of make you feel good? Like, is it something you just, that's your goal, is to publish something that looks clean and flashy? So that was a little shocking that we have this rate without having a lot of the financial pressures we see in other fields. I think we already talked about the early career researcher thing. I guess on the pleasant surprise side, the early career researchers did seem to be a little bit better about reporting exact p-values and reporting effect sizes more consistently, so they claim. And so I think that's good. I think that goes to show that some of our training efforts, because people have been looking at like statistical literacy in applied linguistics and training in statistics for a good while now, and hopefully that's starting to have some positive effects. So that was a pleasant surprise. The other thing that came up, that I think is interesting, if maybe not surprising, has to do with one other item we inserted about whether people had experienced rejection in the publication process due to non-significant results. And that was one thing that sort of seemed to separate the folks who engaged in misconduct from those who didn't. The folks who engaged in misconduct were more likely to report that they had experience being rejected from a journal because, oh, the results weren't significant. And unfortunately, these are things sometimes that reviewers or even editors bring up, like, almost like the study didn't work because you don't have significant findings, so you shouldn't publish it. So I think that's something, yeah, it was nice to see some, not exactly direct evidence, but some suggestion here that like this, over reliance on the null hypothesis significance testing, sort of distortion of it is having ripple effects in terms of researcher conduct, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said resonated a lot with me. I feel like, yeah, there is this this misalignment is like, I don't know. I always find sort of something struck me very deeply is like what's good for science is not necessarily good for the scientists at the moment, at least. So it's like, there's always the push for novel findings, what is your contribution? If you have a non-significant findings, unfortunately, you don't have a lot to say in your paper, right? So it's like there is that sort of this kind of incentive and the actual what's really responsible research practice is really misaligned. So I feel, especially for early career researchers, we're really under a lot of pressure, and we need to sort of make a lot of hard decisions, and we need to face a lot of this type of challenges. I know you have talked already a lot about interesting findings and implications, but I wonder, in your opinion, what would be the most important lesson that we can take from your study?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is hard. I mean, we offer a number of implications, what we think should start happening in the wake of these findings. I guess in general, to kind of synthesize it all down to kind of one important lesson, maybe just be skeptical. And I think like healthy skepticism is good for science, right? And I think it helps your thinking as a scientist. So we don't want to be I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but we should approach a lot of published research findings with some skepticism. And that doesn't have to be an unhealthy, cynical skepticism, but it should be kind of creating a hunger to collect more evidence, right? Like we find a finding that like, oh, wow, this is interesting. This is potentially impactful. We want to build up a stronger evidence base. I don't think we want to rely just on one study anymore. To say like, yes, this is a thing, this is an effect that we can depend on. I think we should be motivated to collect more evidence and build up an evidence base. So thinking more kind of collectively, cumulatively, collaboratively about science, including replication, team science, all that good stuff. And ultimately, like we want to be thinking, how can we check on each other's work? But hopefully in a constructive way. I don't want to like dive into a pit of despair and cynicism here. But yeah, healthy skepticism, I think is a good takeaway from this study.
Yeah, thank you. And as you mentioned, when you clarify why do you want to carry out this study, you and your colleagues believe that not many people have done this in the field of applied linguistics, and as maybe a concluding remark or a final comment after you've done this study, do you believe that the prevalence of scientific misconducts and questionable research practices is more specific to applied linguistics, or is a broader issue in science or other fields as well?
Yeah, good question. I mean, where do we fall, right? I think it's pretty clear that this is an issue that goes across fields, right? We've seen it in psychology, in medicine, in criminology, all kinds of fields. So we're not alone. That's a small comfort in a sense. Like we're not some misfit field of fraudsters. But unfortunately, at least when it comes to the misconduct, we do actually seem to be on the higher end of other disciplines that have been surveyed. We're sort of close to, there was a study by Tidink et al. Looking at, I think, earlier career medical researchers in, like Northern Europe. I want to say the Netherlands. I hope I have that right, either Netherlands or Belgium. And they found an admission rate of about 14%, right? And so we were at 17%. that's kind of where we're at. Other fields have found much lower, around 8% or even less. So we have room to improve. I'd rather, of course, have nobody admitting to doing this anymore, but we want to be, I think, going forward, looking at ways, how do we get down to the lower end of academia, of the sciences. But yeah, this is something we are clearly not alone here. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, we do have a lot of, sort of room for improvement, obviously. And I think maybe you will find sort of in the questions and in actually a lot of the audience will find that we need more training. We need more, simply as a first step, we need more awareness of such issue. So that's why I'm really glad we're having this conversation so that more people can start thinking about this. They can heighten their sort of alertness to the potential issues, or start, question their own sort of practices, or look at it under sort of more scrutiny. I guess for the final question for the interview, could you give some recommendations to our audience and or our network regarding how to address the issues you found in your study?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this, this issue about how do we solve this problem, or how do we start to solve this problem at the very least. And I already see a question in the chat about null hypothesis significance testing. So this is something that comes up in our paper a lot. We talk about it. Some of the QRPs are directly related to that, right? P-values, even some of the misconduct, we talk about significant results, changing the data to get significant results. This is something where actually, with a little bit of hindsight, I think, and this is speaking personally, the paper was a collaborative effort, but personally, I almost feel like we came out, I don't want to say too strong against null hypothesis significance testing, but personally, I feel like p-values and significance testing do have a role. They are valuable tools, but it's easy to get hyperfixated on that p-value and kind of ignore everything else around a statistical model or around an issue that we're investigating. So I think, to one of the questions in the chat already, it's perfectly, of course, fine to look at other frameworks like Bayesian analysis or what have you. But I don't think we need to abandon null hypothesis significance testing. I think we just need to take a more balanced approach to it, look at p-values and things like that alongside confidence intervals, effect sizes, bring in things like equivalence tests so that when we claim there's no difference, we can actually see, how is there actually no difference between two groups or due to some effect, some of that. And I think too, in sort of the larger culture, we'll want to make sure that we push towards, and this is where journals can step in, right? Being willing to publish non-significant results. Knowing something doesn't work, or knowing that two groups of people or things are not really that different, is valuable knowledge and can save other researchers a lot of time or otherwise provide useful information. So that's one thing. And again, I'm not in much of a place to talk about like Bayesian statistics. It's something I know very little of myself, but certainly I think those are exciting directions too. I see a lot of potential for open science, which maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. I think this is a very open science friendly group and venue, but I think, when we look at a survey like this, where people are sort of, again, almost going into the confessional box and in kind of a safe way, getting to admit to things that they've done that maybe are not ideal. Open science kind of is a way we can shine a light on those behind the scenes practices. It kind of puts more decisions, analytical decisions, data handling and cleaning out into the open potentially, which is good. It's also a little bit scary, I think, and I feel this way sometimes myself. I've tried to be very consistent in recent years in publishing my data and analysis scripts openly with my research articles. And part of me, like, I'm sort of dreading, like, ooh, somebody's going to someday find a mistake and either email me or publish a correction. So it's kind of a feeling of dread, but it's also a feeling of like, ooh, but actually that would be kind of cool. If like all this work I put into sharing the data and scripts led to a correction, right? Led to improving our state of knowledge. And I'm just I'm hopeful, and I hope all of you, as most of you, perhaps as early career researchers, develop a mindset like we can do this stuff constructively. It's more not about catching each other, but holding each other accountable, right? And trying to make sure that we're all doing the best work that we can. And so I'm hoping that, if the hammer ever does drop and somebody says, so Dan, it looks like you made an error in your 2019 study. Okay, we could work on it and figure out what's the best way to do this. So that's something I'm hopeful for. And I guess last thought here, I think our professional associations and journals could help with a lot of this stuff when it comes to training for researchers, when it comes to guidelines. One thing with questionable practices is, again, we don't know for sure like what the right thing is to do all the time. And we may never always feel 100% confident in our research and analytical decisions, but it'd be nice to have more resources to help us arrive at answers or decisions we feel confident enough about. So hopefully we'll see more leadership to support individual researchers. So Meng, you said, what's good for science is not always good for the scientist. A lot of times the burden of solving these problems feels like it falls on our shoulders when we're in the middle of a study, right? But hopefully we'll start to see more collective support and efforts to help address these issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really, really well said. I really like your mentality. I think that's a big thing. Like, how do we deal with the errors, or how do we, do the constructive criticism thing? And I think it still sort of takes sort of a long way to go, but I think that's a really, a good mentality that we should all follow. And here, I think, I guess it's a good time for me to shamelessly plug. We do have another event coming up that's exactly on that topic. So it's about fallibility in science. So it's about it's a paper that that's I think is going to be inspiring for a lot of the readers, because it's talking about how should we respond to the errors in other people's work as well as in our own work. So I think that's exactly what you're it's like you share a lot of thoughts with that paper. The paper is by Dorothy Bishop. I don't know whether if you have read of it or not, but yeah, again, that's a sort of our next the last event in this series, I think. So yeah, do shamelessly plug and do stay tuned for that discussion. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. Just for all of you out there in the audience, I mean, I know who Dorothy Bishop is. She's very well known in research methodology, thinking about statistical inference and things. So yeah, that's so fantastic. You're able to bring her into the talk series. That's great.
Yeah, that's very exciting. So that's why, I think this whole sort of meta science theory is coming to a really nice sort of collection, because we do touch upon different aspects. And what you just talked about is indeed sort of hitting a really important point. I think that's sort of a thing that we as a network can do as well, because we can help shift this sort of mentality so that we can develop a more positive or constructive attitude towards this kind of thing. I think that's that wraps up our sort of interview question list, and now I think we can move on to the free Q&A session, and we can probably pause the recording for now so that people can unmute themselves and show up, turn on their videos as well. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the recording now.